ladies and gentlemen, a box. And within that box is the Big Boys Table, episode 57. What's up, Mesk? How you doing?
My box has a dismembered penis in it, but I'll take the table because the penis keeps biting me.
There you go, yeah. So it just needs a seat at the table, that's all.
Yeah.
It is in and of itself a big boy, so I think it's more than qualified.
A floppy boy.
So, speaking of boys, there's a cat game that you've been playing, and it actually is relevant to the topics that we're going to discuss, so right out the gate, we're getting into it actually over here. This episode is mostly going to be targeted around the status quo and how you and I tend to prefer to think of things from outside the box, so to speak, from more of a first principles realm, you could describe it as, where you're not really concerned about how it relates or reflects against the existing games that we already have. More interested in seeing, can you make something that is just by itself 100%, better, or just by itself, like, objectively good, justifies its own existence. And however it pertains to the original content that most people are already familiar with, well, it's probably going to look really good by comparison, but that's not necessarily your primary goal. Mm-hmm. Your primary goal is just to make something good, right? And in that respect, this game stands out from what you've told me about it anyway, and I have admittedly not seen much of it, so you can clue me in and fill me in. This seems like one of those games that is fairly simple in many respects and isn't really doing anything crazy, but still somehow finds a way to get some simple things correct, or at least more things correct than other games. So why don't you fill us in on how you think that the Stray game, the cat game, figures into this topic?
Okay, so I had a good thought in my head, and then I picked up my cup and looked at the cold coffee, and I lost it all. So when I think of a product, I always go in with an objective review. And when you're reviewing things objectively and you're breaking it down into technical elements, you do need to kind of look at what era was it built in. How does that compare to other things of the era? What were the resources and the development? What was the experience? What was the budget, time, so on and so forth. And then, when you're reviewing something, all that's very important to build an objective review of something, to understand what went into it, if what went into it made use of the resources. And then you don't really think of things as a status quo, though. You don't really think of things as, well, this was an accepted standard, so this should be like that. And objective analysis breaks things down into technical elements. And having a good idea of why things are at a point, why things are the status quo, is always a good idea to build perspective. Then you can be as accurate as possible in your assessment. But when building projects, I actually intentionally isolate myself from all outside influences as much as humanly possible. Like, I talked about building D&D stuff. I don't reference external content at all for D&D. The only content I reference is basically official rulings from the developers on the way certain things are intended to work. That were mainly low-level stuff, like things in the PHP or in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I don't reference any third-party stuff unless it's an official book that one of my players wants to use a feeder feature from. I'll have them basically just copy-paste me it, and I'll just rule it on the spot. Honestly, half the time I don't even care if it's official material or not. I just make my own ruling based on if it's balanced or not. And it's I don't usually feel like there's anything to gain from looking at other stuff. And now we go to this cat game. So with this game specifically, I can't say I can do an objective review of it because I have this PTSD lingering from the events of the last 2 years. And the way that I end up dealing with animals is very not good. So it's hard to even describe what it's like, but basically I'm very distant from a lot of things. I don't usually pay quite as much attention, but with this game in particular, it was actually kind of surprising in a lot of ways. First of all, this is a walking simulator. It's not a game. If you come into Stray looking for a game, you will be disappointed because it's not really a game. The most gamey part about it is some fetch questing that you do, and really it's just a walking simulator. The only other walking simulator that I've really played was Last of Us, which was really bad. Apparently not as bad as the second one, which I will never go anywhere near. But Stray definitely stands far apart from that. So recently I played Doom Eternal, which is a very high budget, incompetently slapped together mess, where at just about any point in that game you can sit down for an hour, 2 hours, just looking around and just jotting down a list of all the things that are wrong that you see. I posted some screenshots in the chat earlier that was demonstrating that point. At any point I jump in my video, I can just pause the screen and there'll be something that's wrong on the screen. UV wrapping's fucked. Light maps are fucked, usually some combination of the above. All the environments completely fucked. Particle systems are fucked. There's objects floating in the air. Back faces, clipping. Shit's just everything is fucked in that game. And now we have Stray, which I'm not going to pretend I have any particular real understanding or intimate knowledge of, because I only read up a little bit on it, and then there's a little bit I was told about when I was first getting into it. You have these two guys that came from... I had it here on a window, and of course I lost it when I needed it. They came from Ubisoft. Ubisoft Montpellier. I guess it's in France. And then they founded a product in 2015, and then they grew a little studio around it. And I haven't heard of anything that they've released prior to this. Most of the products in their line, honestly, just look like stuff that you could grab for like $5 off of the Unreal Marketplace as a demo product. They basically had nothing to their name prior to this. And now you have this product that came out many years later. And it's a walking simulator, right? You walk around, you push an interact button, the jumping is on fixed points and all this other stuff. And everywhere all around you right now, you're seeing a lot of people praising this game, or a lot of people drawing issue with the fact that it's actually really quite short. And that part I have no problem with at all. I actually think that the length is actually quite long for what it is. But, I mean, given I spent 8.5 hours on it just fucking around with physics objects, it's... like, it would be a long thing to really go through the whole thing all at once. But the way I look at it is right now, what stood out to me in terms of the feedback that I've read about it, is a lot of people are praising it for high quality, high budget graphics. And I'm just sitting here scratching my head thinking, how could anybody say that? This is just the bare minimum of what should be expected out of any game. They haven't done anything out of the extraordinary with Stray. There's anything that really stands out and wows me and says, wow, they really went through a lot of time and effort for this. It's more like, no, they just went through what's just the bare minimum. The bare minimum of what should be expected. The reality is a lot of people have been gaslit by titles like Doom Eternal and, say, like StarCraft 2 or Diablo 3 into that things just should look like shit. Lighting should always be fucked up. There should always be all these issues. You know, most level design has to be done with invisible Omni lights floating in the middle of the screen or whatever. That's just been LPing and reviewing these products more or less, you know, at a low level since like 2010, I think, when I started with Wings of Liberty and then Darksiders. And ever since the very beginning, I've just seen the same incompetencies over and over and over and over. Doesn't matter how big of a budget the product is. Usually the bigger budget, the worse the production quality. That's been very consistent. Blizzard, Bethesda, these huge, colossal, multi-billion-dollar industries. And oftentimes when you're playing through the product, you wondered if they had a single person ever even look at the fucking thing. What Stray has, and what you will find when you're going through it, is there's two things that, well, there's really more than two things, but two things I would focus on for this cast. And the first is that it's very clear that developers went into the product with some kind of actual genuine intent. And the second thing is that it's very obvious the developers didn't understand Unreal 4 and weren't really sure what they were doing all the way till the very end. So, for example, you can't turn off temporal anti-aliasing. There's no menu option for that. I now discovered that there is actually an INI file, the default Unreal INI file setting you can change. It's locked away in app data somewhere, so I'm actually going to change that and add that to my recordings because I really want to show what the game looks like when you turn on temporal anti-aliasing. The game will, in all likelihood, look 1,000 times better without it on, just like Doom Eternal did. You turn off temporal anti-aliasing in Doom Eternal, hey, at least it looks like a 2004 game finally. There's also like a lot of other post-processing shit that like chromatic aberration at one point, thankfully not on for the rest of the game, and vignette and the auto exposure and stuff like that's really obnoxious. There's graphical issues here and there, light mapping issues in some places. Sometimes it's not high enough resolution and touch shadows don't really get baked. There's a table that's kind of fucked up, and I thought they might have baked the shadows and then moved something off of it, or it's just too low resolution. There's a couple seams here and there. The areas with the Turks, the fleshy bits do not look that good at all. And like more minor stuff here and there overall. It's not like Doom Eternal where in any given place you see hordes of back faces, all the UVs are fucked. Like the length of Stray from start to finish holds less issues in it than any given room in Doom Eternal. And the mood and stuff like that just to me strikes me as, you know, a guy walked into Unreal and made a level in it. And this is kind of just what you ended up with. And it just looks like what you would expect. Like it isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it looks like the textile density and stuff like that's fairly consistent. There's a couple of issues where pieces of paper have a higher textile density than the rest of the scene, and it's not like the paper is something you can read or something like that. You just have games that just decide to devote like 1K, 2K textures to a piece of paper, and then the rest of the scene's like 512. But it's really like that's like in the more minor of stuff. And like when you compare this to all these other products and you think about like these Walk King simulators and the visuals and you know, just the general theme of the run of the things right now where everything has to be screen space oriented and post-processing oriented, then Stray really stands out, and that's one of the reasons why it's getting so many good reviews right now, especially when it pertains to the visuals. So people are comparing this to current modern products, which are usually very large budget, and they look like shit. And people can fanboy as much as these products as much as they want. They can't lie to themselves. They can't lie to their own brains. They know internally, they may not have words to ascribe to it. They know that these products look like shit. They know that the mapping and the lighting and everything in Doom Eternal looks like shit. There's no excusing that. That's an objective fact. The objective fact, and that your eyes and your brain will tell you, is that something like Stray, with much greater degrees of consistency, much greater degrees of technical competency, and at least having a developer, at least at one point in its production lifespan, actually go through the product and look at it at some point, it just made the result more consistent and of a higher quality. And when I read through the reviews, most of the reviews are going to be like, oh, it's a cat game, I'm going to buy it. The game is basically living off of memes, right? But there is still a chunk of reviews that pertain to the visuals and the lighting and the stuff like that. And to me, it's like, well, nothing stands out because I'm just looking at it for what I know it to be. Is they had a number of people working for a long time at this, but it was clear throughout the entire project lifespan, it was still fairly low scale. I don't know what their budget was like, but they didn't have an army of people slapping their dicks on this like Bethesda did. And at some point within this product, they actually gave a shit. Now, it's also very obvious throughout the product's lifespan, they got very confused about how to deal with a lot of things in this. There's definitely a lot of feature creep. There's a lot of design creep. They got confused about how to handle any of the combat sections. They certainly got very confused about how to tie the premise of being a cat character into any kind of world building. And they got really carried away with that. But at the same time, throughout all these elements, you walk through this product getting the impression that somebody at some points gave a shit about this. There's a lot of problems in it because I feel like it's just like the developers weren't experienced. They didn't have anybody on their staff that were really experienced. They didn't have anybody to really sit down and say, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this with temporal anti-aliasing because it makes everything look like a goddamn mess. A lot of people out there don't even realize that you can turn temporal anti-aliasing off and, oh, suddenly the game looks sharp again. It's the default setting on. Most people just make the assumptions that defaults should be on, like a mouse smoothing and stuff like that. You still have a lot of products today that release that if you have a gamepad plugged in, it just assumes you only want to use the gamepad, and it'll lock out your mouse controls until you unplug the fucking gamepad. I've run into that countless times.
Very useful.
But when I look at it, I just see it as a product. It's like, hey, a guy sat down in Unreal and built these levels with these assets, and it looks reasonably consistent, and they didn't go all the way sticking invisible lights and stuff everywhere like that. And I can really appreciate that because it means they didn't buy into the shitty memes like Doom Eternal, where people just did shit for the sake of it because someone in their shitty college computer science class told them that this makes games edgy along with a number 3, which, by the way, they also managed to avoid in this game. The fetch quests are usually 4. And that was probably one of the things that shocked me the most about this title start to finish.
So it sounds a lot like, and again, it's coming from somebody who hasn't played the game, hasn't even really seen the game. I think I saw the splash art on Steam one day when they pop up with those advertisements after you launch the program, which most of the time don't even load correctly because Chromium. And after hearing you talk a little bit about it, it sounds very much like something that adds a lot of fuel to the fire of the argument that, hey, if you actually look at the product you're working on, you might make some better decisions about how you're laying it out and how you're making it function. And also, this is a belief that I think is echoed by a lot of actual, we'll say, like, people who have launched indie titles and have also talked with a lot of their own friends who exist within these more, we'll say AAA for the sake of it, but these more mainstream studios. Those people tend to have this opinion that too many cooks in the kitchen spoils the broth, but in a really fundamental way, like turned up to 11 with video games, where everything is so precarious, where you could have, you're shipping with bugs you don't even know about. It's just like a guarantee, basically. And the more people you have touching your shit, the more fucked up it's going to be at the end of the day. Of course, they probably use different terms than I do. They probably describe it more elegantly. But the fundamental aspect of it simply is, it seems to me like if you do have a smaller team, if you do have, maybe they do have to work for longer as a result of it, but the end result is going to be infinitely more consistent, which is a word you use that I picked up on, is that like the game doesn't deviate from its own style of art, and it doesn't have all of these clashing elements the same way that obviously, like the counter example of Doom Eternal being there as games we've both recently played. That just tells you right then and there people didn't care too much about the product when there is actually like really high resolution signs and pieces of paper, but the enemies are all like 2004 at best, So it's one of those things where if you do actually succeed in getting a consistent style out and a consistent level of quality between all of the assets and the texture densities and stuff like that, then, or texture resolutions, sorry, the main idea there is you do actually get a better product. And if you are willing to take your time on it, then you don't need to buy into all of the, the main topic of this show being there's a box and everybody feels like they're trapped inside of it, or they don't know that they're trapped inside of it. It's like a goldfish in water. It doesn't even know that they're in the fish tank, so to speak. That feels like a lot of people, and when you do get a game like this, it's like, oh, hey, maybe you did this accidentally, maybe you did this intentionally, and you actually are aware of it, but you didn't buy into all of the, you bought into some of it, like the default TXAA, but you didn't buy into everything. You didn't have a bunch of screen space shit or Omni lights or whatever. You didn't decide that you needed to use 3 for everything. You didn't decide that, you had to buy into all of these trends and hop on the bandwagon for a lot of these things. You actually were able to just take a step back and think what works best for your project, what works best for your product. It definitely feels like not too many people are doing that right now, and are more well. They're thinking what's best for their product in the sense that they're thinking what's best for their bottom line, maybe, or if they're in a monolithic, enormous company. They're like, okay, how can I do like the least amount of work and still get paid, right? Or how can I survive this vicious development cycle where I'm going to be really butchered, So at that point, the priority isn't the product. It's like, survival, or it's scamming for money, or whatever the case might be. Or it's like, you're a marketer on this project instead of an actual developer, so your priority is also money. So, yeah, I mean, without sounding like we're getting onto naivete and all this other stuff where we're thinking like, oh yeah, well, why would you ever want to make money and all that shit? Just considering the angle of like the product first and making it good and making it, for example, like just that idea is almost radical in this day and age, especially for video games, it feels like. And so it is funny to me that evidently the reviews seem to be more disproportionately focused on the fact that there's a cat involved, but
it's not surprising at all, really.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if surprising is the right word. To me, it's just it's goofy because it underscores like the flimsiness of the nature of success, where you could have a game and it's like it's got really great gameplay, excellent visuals. You really worked your heart out. But what people really like about it is that you get to play as a wolf, dude. Like that's epic. I want to be a wolf in a game.
Like with this game, at most points in this game, it doesn't even matter what the player character is. You could have any animal, you could have a human character, a robot character. It doesn't matter, because most of the major parts of the game, you aren't doing something that's really cat-like. Like, it's sold as a cat game, and you're given a cat main character, but the vast majority of the game is basically jumping from point to point in fixed points, and then basically talking to NPCs. It's a walking simulator. There really isn't any gameplay. You don't have the mobility of a cat. There's not really that many interactable objects in it. It loses sight of itself as a cat sim fairly quickly into it. But the thing is that it just being about cats, that's going to make it sell no matter what it is. Because that is just how shallow most people are about games. And, well, I think this game manages to obtain a better degree of consistency in holding to itself together. It's really obvious, again, like I said before, throughout it, that they got kind of lost and confused about what they wanted to do, and they tried to inject too many ideas into it, and so it really loses sight of being a cat sim at that point. And with a lot of these products, like Dark Souls, for example, it will sell just because people want to identify as people who play hard games, and they think that Dark Souls is a hard game, so they're going to buy it, and most people will never even get past the first bonfire, much less get into Souls and experience it for what it is. But they just want to be a part of that crowd that identifies as someone who plays hard games. They see Souls, they buy. It's the same thing as brand loyalty. The only thing that's ever kept Blizzard going all these years, it certainly isn't the quality product or titles. They've gaslit themselves into thinking that StarCraft 2 is an acceptable game because StarCraft 1 was an alright game. So of course StarCraft 2 is going to be a good game. It's Blizzard. They make good games. That's what a lot of these people tell themselves to the point until they start believing it. And then the other half of that is memes. Things have to be driven by memes. You've probably noticed this too, with these recent projects really standing out. And of course, the ones I've told you about where people focus on updates more than anything. There are actually people out there who think that likes determine the value of something, who think that updates determine the value of something. And the best way to spread traffic through updates and likes is by attaching memes to it. And this game here was destined for success, Stray that is, pretty much no matter what it did at this point because of its exposure as a game in which you play as a cat. And in fact, the cats are one of the most memed animals in all of existence. You got lol cats and everything else. Cats are really like the de facto internet mascot in a way. So of course a game that which you play as a cat is going to see some degree of success literally no matter what the actual product is. Although Steam may be changing the way it tracks achievements now because I've used the achievement tracking as a metric for a long time until the last couple of years when I stopped really following it that much other than the Souls games. They may have changed it. It doesn't track people who haven't launched it anymore, but at least from what I've noticed with Stray is that at this point in time, of course the game is still quite new, is that most people who get past the first 15 minutes end up finishing the game. And that's an amount of retention that I really didn't expect despite its short length.
Yeah, you touched a bit about the short length aspect, and I feel like this is another example right now, in the current moment. We have games that it feels like every game that comes out of a modern studio at this point has to be a 40 to 90 hour epic open world adventure. That seems to be like, if it's going to be a single player game, then that's the direction people are taking.
And it's all grind.
And it does all feel grind. It doesn't feel like you're getting time to explore a rich world and your time is well spent. Now, of course, I don't think either of us have played Elden Ring at this point, but that's like the most recent big name. Yeah, that's the most recent big name example of that. And it's one of those games where I assume what's going to happen is that, yes, there's the Souls-like combat. I saw somebody stream a little bit of it, and they were totally absent-minded, not paying attention at all to what was going on their screen, talking to their chat, and just A-moving, basically like the Souls equivalent of A-moving, face-rolling through a bunch of zombie enemies that were literally doing nothing. So yeah, I hope that's not classic. Most of the game, but if that is most of the game, that's really bad.
What I've seen is that GIF that someone posted method where the enemies input read you even if they're not even locked on, and if you cast a spell, everything on the entire screen dodges. That is also very Souls. Like that's From Software in a nutshell right there. All their products are pretty much like that. Either enemies that input read or enemies that just are inactive, The rest of the bosses are all scripts, basically.
Yeah, well, I still remember like when you had a playthrough. I think it might have been the first game, or maybe this was even as far back as Demon Souls. But there was some enemy that like walked into a hole and died, and you were like, "Wow, they don't even see the third axis." Like,
yeah, no, they don't. They don't in most of those games. I don't think in any of the games they see the third axis at all. I'm pretty sure in every single Souls game, and I doubt Elder Ring will be any different. It's just a script that just points to the player's coordinates, and then they snap onto a waypoint or something that's nearby. They got more aggressive with waypointing in Dark Souls 3, but there are still many places where, like in front of the Demon Princes, I remember, you zone in, you get souls, seemingly from nothing. That's an enemy just falling off the world space and killing themselves, and you get currency for it. It's very consistent in all those games, yeah.
Yeah, that's always very humorous to me.
So Elden Ring is, from what I've heard, it's different than the other games in the grinding aspect, because it sounds like a lot of the gear that you get is drops now, and with drop rates that are quite low on seemingly fewer enemies. So I don't know, like, I mean, Souls is balanced in such a way, which, to be fair with it, is certainly better than the alternatives, where you can really go through at least any of the games I've played so far, being Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and then Dark Souls 3. I started 2, but I haven't gotten that deep into it, where you can basically wear just about anything, and it doesn't make a tremendously big difference at any point, with some things like Flynn's Ring having less weight means more damage or something like that, you being able to maximize it. Or if you're trying to do Poya stuff like I was in Dark Souls when it was absolutely bonkers broken. But it's suffice to say, it sounded like Elden Ring does much more focus on, like, a lot of the comments I saw about it was much more grind oriented than the other ones if you wanted anything specific out of it. And I don't know. I can't really, like I said, I can't really comment too much on it because I haven't played it yet. Yeah. But it does sound like they took a lot of different directions in it. They made it easier, apparently. Although there was comments that, because there's also Bloodborne as well, which is also basically Souls. But apparently Bloodborne does a little bit of changes with the parrying. They try to make it more parrying focused and deviate away from blocking. So apparently Elden Ring's monsters are more designed like Bloodborne monsters, and then they tend to endlessly chain together root motion, but it's still using more Souls-oriented combat where I guess you can't really parry them, or you're not as able to, or whatever. And some people definitely voiced a lot of annoyances with that, where some of the enemies were extremely irritating to deal with, because basically they don't have an AI in those games. What they do have is very long, scripted together root motion attacks that track you. And if you play all these games, you'll notice that, like in Demon Souls, the enemies have like 1 or 2 attacks, and then they just don't do anything. And most of the enemies, you can just run up, walk around them, backstab them, and that's it. In Demon Souls, they changed that. The enemies basically pivot to face you all the time, including while they're attacking. And then when you go to Dark Souls 3, and probably Dark Souls 2, because I'm pretty sure Dark Souls 3 recycles over half the assets from the second game, including all the other games, of course. They've been recycling the animations and stuff since Demon Souls. But they straight up recycle like armor and everything, like the art and everything is straight up 1-to-1. So I'm sure that a lot of monsters and stuff in Dark Souls 3 are the same, but they start chaining together a lot of root motion attacks that just trace and follow you, and that's their idea of making the game more difficult. The problem is, of course, is that the collision in those games is very Holy Spirit-esque, where my favorite is Pontiff Sullivan's short sword that will hit you like a full 5 feet fucking behind his hand. And there are, of course, plenty of videos and images of Dark Souls 2 where enemies can swing in one direction and you'll be hit behind them, so I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, AI is just not really a thing. Like that, like when you think about like the box.
Yeah.
When I think about these games, the first thing I think about is AI. Like, it's just an accepted standard in every single game in existence to not have computer AI. And in some cases, people even think that it's impossible to have an at least superficially intelligent AI, on modern software, like in modern hardware. Like they've deluded themselves into thinking it's too expensive on the processor to have AI in a video game. I've just always found that absolutely insane, and that's just a widely accepted myth that games just can't
the
have
other
AI.
angle on this, the other angle that they take is if it's not too expensive, then it wouldn't be fun, or it wouldn't even be worthwhile, because, well, if you make it really good, then no player can ever get good. Like, because it's like nested paradigms that are just wrong, but they've accepted them. And the first one is, maybe it's expensive, or maybe there's some like really difficult technical thing that you have to surmount, and in order to actually make it happen at all. And then the deeper one is, well, games are inherently solvable by just doing more actions because they're all chores. And so if you make an AI that never gets tired and never deals with the chores, then they have an advantage and you'll never be able to square that. It's like, come on. Maybe the game shouldn't be a series of fucking chores, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually a good thing, because then the AI is exposing a weakness in your entire product.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, you want to talk about AI-driven learning. How about that? That's actually a case where it can be useful.
Yeah, AI is like that. That's something that's always baffled me, because that AI is what got me into building custom content in general. Is when StarCraft first came out, and I was making UMS maps and layering locations on each other to make the AI stronger by running multiple AIs. And then Star Draft and everything came out, and I got introduced to SEAI Edit when it first came out. That was my first thing, because I played Skirmish nonstop. So then I introduced AI. And it's just always been an intrinsic thing to what I do. Any game I've ever looked into has always been like, what can I do with the AI? Like, obviously, like, we go to Sins of a Solar Empire, it's hard-coded. Well, I guess I'm not making a total conversion in this. Age of Wonders 2, it's also hard-coded. There's ways you can try to cheat it, but ultimately, at the end of the day, my year and a half of project with that game died because you can't do anything in the AI, and the world AI in particular was bad. Warcraft 3, same thing. StarCraft 2, same thing. All my research and success and failures is really centralized around AI and AI performance. And then I look around, and I'm just disgusted by the fact nobody even seems to think that AI can even be a thing. Like, I still remember with StarCraft 2, how many, like, literally every single person at Mapster either said it wasn't possible to have custom AI in a dependency replacing the melee, which, yes, you can't. Like, why wouldn't you be able to? It's the same as replacing any other default file. Like, they didn't even understand how the file structure for this game worked. They didn't understand how the basic fundamentals of replacing file structures worked at all. And they were trying to discourage me and telling me it's not possible to customize the melee AI for this game. And I would literally had already done it. And there are just like, there was so many people, and then they would say it's not possible to get into. I mean, to be fair, that game's AI is an absolute hard-coded mess, because it's Blizzard and everything always has to be boilerplated in hard code. But what I accomplished with it was basically every single person who had described themselves as experts in this game had believed to be completely, entirely impossible. And in reality is that they likely had never even attempted it. Never even looked at it. The accepted standard for AI within any custom content for these games is to not have AI and to just spawn waves. That's the way Blizzard does it. They don't even have a defense functions. One word ahead of myself. Defense functions fucking exposed in that editor of theirs. Yeah, that piece of shit they pass off as an editor. And if you try to use the wave system and try to assign defense to it, it's going to fall apart, because the melee system's its own mess. And you can tell just by looking at the way the game's structured, between the way the editor exposes stuff, the way they did their campaign, and the way the melee AI is done. It was two entirely different people. They never communicated. One tool set was made for the games for the melee AI, promptly abandoned. And then the people making the campaigns were like, we don't know anything about this. We don't want to get involved in this. We're just going to be lazy. And that's like, nobody within the span of Blizzard throughout the entirety of that heaping 3 installation pile of shit they try to pass off as a campaign even stopped to think maybe we should have AI in a fucking RTS. And as a result, it's all chores and gimmicks and bullshit. But that's like it's not like that's a one-off. It's not like Blizzard is unique in this sense. Nobody in all of the fucking RTS market period thinks about AI. If they did, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
Well, that's the thing is the whole point of me bringing up the idea of like the single player games being open world focused and grind focused, and then your point about the AI and all that is it's the same thing, right? It's like if you guys just so first of all, if the developers of these seminal titles like Brood,
oh, the toasters are fighting.
All right, Discord is reasonable. So basically, what I was saying is that if you had these seminal titles and they were good, they actually had the things necessary. You think about Brood War. If it actually had custom AI editor, wrapped up in like Bob Fitch claims to have wanted, then there's such a situation arises where it becomes like an accepted standard in content that you would edit AI along with a map, right? But now because that's not,
you would think that. But Warcraft 3 shipped with an AI editor, and that was also a disaster.
Well, that's true. This thought experiment presupposes that the software is functional, which it rarely is. But you could imagine that just by virtue of having more access to it, maybe that means that the developer, like the custom tool devs or whatever, like the person who made SCM Draft 2, maybe he gets into reverse engineering some of the AI stuff or like unlocks more features or whatever, and then like his editor's version of that has more stuff in it. I don't know. Like there's many things that could change as a result of that, right? But you also think like, if these initial games had stuff that better equipped content developers to think outside of their own box, maybe it wouldn't really help them. Like maybe the issue is that then the box they'd be in would just be slightly bigger and they would still have to like think outside of it. That's probably more likely. But I like to imagine that if we at least had an easy counterexample, and this is one of the reasons why I've decided to really go headfirst into some single-player RTS content development, is that like if you just have an example of AI that actually tries to beat you, actually tries to win, and isn't some insurmountable monolithic task to defeat where it's like impossible to beat it. Like if you actually have something like that, then you can't have the excuse of it's not performant. Even on modern hardware, it won't work. Yeah, how about this program that only consumes like 300 megabytes of memory? Mm-hmm. How about that? Like how about that for your fucking impossible thing to do? And then you get it's not fun. Well, okay, you can tell me like what is not fun about this experience? Is it because you're bad? Huh? Is that it? You need to get a higher rank than D- on ICUP? But like even beyond that, it's like you at least have something to point to and say, hey, like maybe these people will never shift their paradigms, so to speak. Maybe they'll never get outside the box. But it does feel to me like we live in an era where the only people who will ever make the better thing are people who don't even accept the status quo as desirable in any capacity. Which is not to say that like, a point that was made when I was interviewing Jonathan Blow for the second time was he said that like there was a subtle point there that he had said, you don't want to devalue literally everything that's gotten us to this point, because then you ignore like the achievements of people building computers for the first time, for example, and like all of that stuff that got us here. And we're both big fans of how powerful modern hardware is, and we bemoan modern software being terrible. But if you go back far enough, there's software that's performant, there's software that's good, and it's possible to still make that now. And we all exist in some ways on the shoulders of giants where like we didn't, learn assembly and learn C code and all this stuff to write all of the compilers and programs that we use on a daily basis. And, we're still using tools, even as people who are using Unreal or building our own engine, we're still using other people's tools in many respects. So we can't say that there's no value in that, and nor should we necessarily want to. But the point is to not get lost in the status quo. That's, for me, what really most people should be trying to do is, like, consider in what ways do you have these base assumptions that you've just bought into everything with? In what ways are you like the hysterical example of people who think that AI is impossible, or that, I don't even know what the people who apologize for the grind in Elden Ring are, although admittedly haven't played that game, so maybe it's overblown from the naysayers. But my point would just be like, if you are the examples we're bringing up here probably don't apply to the people who are listening, but if you imagine for a second that like maybe there's going to be ways that you, Mesk, that I myself, that many other people have these like preconceived notions. And if we could think outside of them, it might give us a better perspective to whatever work we're doing. Maybe it wouldn't really be that productive for depending on what purpose you're using. But if you're trying to control your spending decisions, your purchasing decisions, and you're trying to curtail it away from the same old repackaged mess, then that would be one step closer. That would be getting us one step closer to, as a perhaps not as a total industry, but at least as the people who are enthusiasts about games, helping to push the needle in some other direction. Something other than literally like Madden 2023 or whatever, where it's just the same shit. Except the only like grand innovation is how they can nickel and dime you. That's pretty much it. So, I mean, that's the big paradigm that's shifting too. Is pricing in video games, where now the developers or publishers or whatever are trying to argue that games need to be $70 instead of $60 as the premium pay.
Well, they're $90 here already, and they have been for a while.
Canada. But the thing that gets me about that is that obviously distribution costs went way down when we switched over to digital primarily, and that's been like that. That's been status quo for a while as well.
Yeah.
Then you have to consider like, okay, if your games are getting more expensive to build, then maybe there's a problem with instead of just passing that off to the consumer, like maybe you need to look internally as to how you can make your process not so expensive. No, nobody ever even thinks about that. That's like a paradigm that developers themselves are in, that they need to get out of as quickly as possible. Because
they're trying to do that here too with, I forget precisely what it was. It was something that the government was trying to do that was going to cost the ISPs money. So the general consensus was that the ISPs were just going to hike the prices on the customers instead. Like that's how this kind of stuff always goes.
Yeah. It's just like the whole thing doesn't even make sense when you consider that like you're actually, even though you think you're making more money, it's in the long run going to result in less overall numbers of sales. And like one thing is inflation, whatever, that's a separate thing. But you're going to have less sales over time because less people can afford to buy the game or will make that choice now that it's $10 or $30 more expensive or whatever. And then you also get the problem of like you still haven't fixed the root problem that's causing this infinite like this recursive thing where eventually you have to raise the price because your development team is too expensive, right? And it goes back to the too many cooks in the kitchen thing. Now, I don't know if it's still kind of an open question as to how possible it is to get a game on the scale and scope of Elden Ring developed in a reasonable time frame, which is vague, but whatever term you think like 5 years max for that maybe would be the cutoff point.
Couple months
without having a really large amount of people. Like I assume it's possible, but that's something that I haven't personally explored and tested, right? And so if you wanted to go for something really big and ideally better than Elden Ring, but still keeping the scale, maybe even increasing the scale in terms of the universe, the game world itself. And you still wanted to, like, at that point you wanted to cut down on team size, but then have, like, this small team of passionate auteurs who are actually here to build something special. I mean, if the game's industry or whatever, like, survives the rubble when they implode, were to go in that direction, then I feel like you would get somewhere. But I don't know how you would square the issue of having to work on games for a long time. Maybe that's something that we should just be going back to. Maybe games should just be taking a while. The idea that you can spit them out, I don't even think you can spit out a movie in less than like 2 years. And people are trying to do that or make it so that they're coming out very frequently. And I feel like
they want to spit out a new version of Windows every couple years
now. No. That's not legal. I mean, they can't even spit out one, so.
Yeah, well, that's not going to discourage them.
Yeah. It's just one of those things where it's like the other idea is that games should be like movies in many respects. And one of the ways that's, I think, nefarious and subtle, and maybe people don't think about too much, is the development cycle of them. And I don't think the development cycle should be like I don't even think movies can, like a good movie can really be done unless you have a hyper specialized and experienced group of auteurs. Again, maybe then they can make it in 2 years. If it's a 90-minute thriller that's like back-to-back action-packed or whatever. I don't know what the genre would be. Like maybe then you can do it 2.5 years. The idea that you can do a really big game like what Elden Ring purports to be and then also deliver it on making it good, but only work on it for a couple of years. It just seems like it doesn't square with me. And if you want the game to actually be good, and actually deliver on the premise that it's supposed to be delivering on, the premise that built it, really, the premise that it serves as its foundation conceptually, then it needs to have time to be made good, to be made properly. And it doesn't feel like you get that in the modern ecosystem either. It's almost like, we talked about what are the purpose of, episodes like these, what are the purposes of Let's Plays that we do, that increasingly, recently you've been doing more than I've been doing, that's for sure. And the idea is these serve as educational materials. These serve as little outposts of knowledge amidst the ocean of insanity. And hopefully, with this education, assuming you agree with what we end up laying out, and you're receptive to the ideas that may be true, that you have to, of course, go through and vet and decide if they're accurate, then at that point, ideally anyway, what you'd be able to do is say, okay, I now know more information about how games are developed or what limitations games might realistically have versus what is just marketing talk and apologism and all of this other stuff. And hopefully that would work, but it does feel like the average consumer really is just completely uneducated. And it speaks to probably a significantly deeper issue with society. And as a result of the fact that these consumers aren't educated, we get purchases for things that just have the most marketing, right? If you think of evolutionary theory, the only reason why the industry has gone this direction is because it seems to work in the short term at the very least. And you and I both have doubts about how long the industry can last doing this. And also, I don't even really think it's going to work long term. And I also think there's an aspect of where you are basically in some way sacrificing your own soul on the altar of money in order to build this, for lack of a better term. In order to go down this route, you're losing some part of yourself that you would otherwise have kept intact if you had just decided to take 20% less money, but actually been more honest. Or I don't know what the exact figures would be, but that's just an example. It's it feels like without the education, you're not really going to be able to affect actual change. But also, the people have to be willing to be educated. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And I honestly don't know where I was going to go with this as an actual question. So I hope you have something to say now.
Consumers are definitely not educated. I mean, the average person isn't educated in general. Education has been a joke for the last 20 years. It was a joke when I was still in school. It's much more of a joke now. Critical thinking, for example, is actively discouraged at all levels of education these days. And you are not allowed to be critical of opinions or ideas or imaginary things or, whatever bullshit they come up with in that present time. And you are even punished for doing so. You're punished for encouraging critical thinking. That happens in my country very recently, within the last couple of years. Critical thinking classes and people trying to teach them were brought up and interrogated and attacked by the system at large, because this is not allowed. And the problem with most consumers today is that when you are critical of anything or suggest anything can be different, they see it as attacks on their purchasing decisions. And people don't like to be wrong about things. People like to think that they can never be wrong about things. If you question somebody's purchasing decisions, you're questioning their very reason to exist. They will immediately become defensive about it. They'll bottle up, and that's it. Now, personally, I have never given too much of a shit about trying to educate people, trying to discourage bad purchasing decisions, trying to get out there and change things, because I know it's futile. Many years ago, I tried to get more publicly involved in stuff. And of course, when I started casting, I did harbor some ambitions of, and I had the potential, of course, to become, the mainstream caster. I was at the right time. I was at the right point. But I realized I had to make a decision between doing what I wanted to do, which at the time, it was when I was casting StarCraft 2, I got switched from what I was doing to there was a lot of pressure to switch to casting only professional matches. And I was finding a lot more entertainment at the time casting the silly FFAs, the random shit people were sending me in my email and stuff like that. But the community at large that was otherwise floating around at that point wanted me to focus more or less on the professional stuff. And if I had focused on the professional stuff, I would have continued to grow. My channel was very young. I already had over 1 million channel views, thousands of subscribers. I had these fucking partnership channels and stuff like that trying to suck my dick, and machinima, curse, etc., the works. And I could have made that decision, and if I had made that decision, maybe things would look better, or better financially today, but probably a lot worse in every other way, because then they got to have possession of your account. You half the content I had on it would have to have been deleted. Of course, then I had to start watching what I say. I can't put like LPs on there or whatever. The rules and restrictions are absolutely absurd. Like, you can't even have I think like game cinematics and certain music and stuff like that, even though it wasn't like a copyright issue, it was something that they can't monetize or something like that. Like, this just... And of course, nowadays I talk to people who do like virtual singing and VTuber stuff, and they have like, close to 1 million subs, and they have to basically live like double life. I mean, this person technically lives a triple life, because there's the life that we know her on, there's her VTuber life, and then there's her real life, and she's got to keep all this stuff separate, and nothing that she says to us can never be said in her channel. She has to be a completely different person, and it's like, I guess a lot of people get away doing with that. I just say, fuck this shit. It's not worth it to me. And, like I said also before, all the job offers I got for modeling and stuff like that, I could have gone into those. Sure, I could have followed Oracle along and done all the 3D graphic stuff he was begging me to do, for the second time at that point for his shitty StarCraft 2 campaign, and I could have gotten payment for it, but there's dignity involved in all of this. And when it comes to like the whole education thing and changing people's minds or opening people's eyes or whatever, to me it's just like actions always speak louder than words. Anybody can talk. I can talk. You can talk. They can talk. Hitler can talk. And then at the end of the day, if you want to ever have a strong point to actually convince people that there's something outside of their cradle, actions will always speak louder. Having that counterexample as an actual example is always the most powerful thing. With StarCraft 2, at the time, I just pointed to my various Apex videos and I said, hey, look, I had an AI that was functional in this. We fixed a lot of the attack pathing. We had much more consistent RTS gameplay in that than StarCraft 2 will ever see in its lifespan decades from here on. I firmly believe there will never be a single person who ever will even get close with StarCraft 2 in the AI to what HKS and I got together with an Apex, for the simple fact that nobody is actively pursuing it. And if somebody does actually actively pursue it, they probably get into reverse engineering, and then that's subject to a huge gray area with the way that StarCraft 2 is handled, because of how aggressive Blizzard has been about seriously checking the archives and all this other shit to kill mods. So, it's very unlikely anybody will ever get that far with it, and it still wasn't really enough. But what we had was still demonstrably breaking the conventions that people thought were impossible.
Right.
People said that this couldn't be done. Well, we did it, and we did a hell of a lot more with it than what the product normally had. And that point, at that, like, I don't even need to talk about it. Like, I can just say, hey, if you have access to my videos, I believe some of those dev videos are up there.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, that's just, it's like that. I don't need to talk about it at that point. Like, and then, it would be nice to have an equivalent for an actual fleshed out single player experience, as opposed to a video of something that was in development stages. It would be nice for the other things I had been experimenting on, the Apex campaign in itself. If I'd actually finished that StarCraft 2 campaign, I don't think we'd even be having half of these discussions. Because that counterpoint, all you would ever have to say is just, go play the fucking campaign, or go look at a run of the campaign. Like, that just shows and demonstrates everything, because that's what it was. But again, with the AI, as far as we got with it, there was absolute major issues with it, from the performance to the way the expansions were handling and shit like that, right? So, great is just an idea. And when you think about the boxes and stuff like that, and you think about ideas and stuff like that, is kind of like what you were saying with the Jonathan Blow comment about not disregarding everything. When I do either a review or when I look at something from a more casual standpoint or whatever, I try to look at ideas as intended execution and what those ideas have merit as. So, when we look at all the stuff that people don't even look at AI and stuff like that, it's just like, what kind of product do you have that could have benefited from this? I look at an invisible bridge. And, with the AI, it's like, this is what could have been possible, and I know what was possible. Like with StarCraft 2, for example, the only thing that held back the Apex project was the AI and through the performance and then the general functionality. That's what held it back. I already had functional examples of literally everything else that was on the roster for that. The unit concepts, the most advanced, the data editing stuff, everything that I'd thrown at the concepts had already been bricked out and was proven to be functional. The maps were not demanding. And I guess the pre-rendered videos would have been really difficult because StarCraft 2's innate video support was really bad. But, that even how I was going to handle that was not entirely decided. But the fact is we had all these ideas with proven concepts and proven functionality. And then each of those still had a degree of merit that proved that this was a thing that could have existed. But it didn't exist. So it still doesn't exist really as a counter example. But I always still reference that for the ideas and the things they represented, because those ideas and things represented came paired with experiences that showed that this could and should and would be a thing. And that if it was a thing, this is what the net result would be. Having ideas and being willing to actually sit down and put them down is an important thing, and that is absolutely something that will come into the time spent for development process and why you need time to make quality. With something like Elden Ring, as an Elden Ring example, it's just using a huge amount of recycled assets. So it wouldn't take that much time to make, because most of these products that From Software makes, they slap together everything, they maybe make a few new things, and then they push it out, and they usually don't even test it. And then they do what's called like agile or trunk development, which is how most companies handle software these days, where they push out the alpha product, and then they may or may not patch it along the way until they end it with something that's like halfway towards what would be finished. And then they call it a done job because they're no longer making money anymore, and they move on to the next thing. And like Roll20 is like that. It's absolutely putrid and disgusting. And that's like those examples. But if you wanted to make something in the scale of this, you're going to go through these iterative processes of bringing out ideas and then breaking those ideas. Ideas are there to be brought up, to be tested,
yes,
to be put under stress, to validate them. And going back to Stray momentarily, something that got me kind of interesting when I was reading the Wikipedia article for it, is apparently, because all the characters in the game other than the cat are basically robots. And they had originally intended to use human characters, but they figured that they can't actually make them look good enough within their budget. I guess their artist wasn't good enough to make it, and they didn't have time to really flesh it all out. So then they switched to these robot characters. And these robot characters, what kind of really stood out to me looking back at the game, was that the game is kind of like a child's game. And the robots are these kind of like goofy, lighthearted, cartoony kind of characters, but the game is realistically styled. The aesthetic is realistic. It's sort of like a mix of like industrial and cyberpunk. And the robots fit into that. They managed to make these sort of silly, lighthearted characters without having to destroy the game with this god-awful, quote-unquote, stylized shit we see so many of these companies deferring to because it's so cheap and easy and lazy to do. They don't do that within this game, and yet they still manage to have these characters that could fit in that concept, but they're fitting instead in the concept of something that's realistic aesthetically. And one of the main things that really walked out of that was the mindset that they went behind that, where they decided to try these ideas instead. And they came up with something that completely shatters all the expectations of you having these modern titles, where if it's going to be something that isn't necessarily very serious, it has to be like 3 shades of color and look like some mobile piece of shit like Genshin Impact. And that all came as a result of them just validating ideas, at least according to this text.
Well, it goes to the point where, like, when you have an idea, or when you have built a tech demo to explore an idea, basically, like, it's almost like people think of, like, there are kinds of, like, different kinds of tech demonstrations, I suppose. There's actual technical demonstrations of here's what's possible within this environment, but then there's, like, another layer to that, which is a conceptual demonstration where here's what is both technically possible to do because you're experiencing it by running the software, but also conceptually this is split apart and set apart from what else you're used to, right? It's like a two-pronged assault where you have both this is technically feasible and this is conceptually, like, you can assess how good it was, right? So you can see not only does this run physically, like it's a technical demonstration of it working in that sense, but you can assess how well it was put together. You can decide whether it was, properly set up, to your point about the stray robots, and like, does it fit within the art style? You can just sort of look at that. Does it feel too distant from everything else because it was a later decision in the development cycle to pivot away from human enemies and instead have robots? Well, when you can assess those things, like, basically what I'm trying to get at is you're not guaranteed a good result just because you have an idea of something better than what we've already dealt with.
Most often you won't. Most often you're going to be throwing out stuff. At least that's how it should be going.
It's precisely because of the fact that you are going down untrodden territory in many respects. You're branching off onto a path that has been maybe less traveled, maybe never traveled. Certainly, you're not going to find a lot of documentation from other people trying to do the same thing. Like, if you're lucky, you might find something like that, but I say lucky as well with a little bit of doubt, because maybe it's better for you to just go on your own path without too much guidance in that respect after you build up an understanding. Like, I was thinking about this in the context of a video I released recently on ambition, and how my mindset is basically that I don't want to consider much of the status quo to have value in terms of further exploration. And maybe that's like a better way to put it, is that it's not that we devalue everything that we already have. It's that it's just a rehash, right? So if you're spinning your wheels stuck in the mud, doing nothing different now, or very incremental improvements or steps that feel incomplete towards a better thing, then, like, that's just going to frustrate me, who can actually see and extrapolate out and think of and imagine a better thing. And then maybe I should just go and test that because nobody else seems to, right? And that seems to be like a defining theme of both of our times with games, is that, like, you'll get a game and you'll imagine all the potential that could have happened if X and Y were different. But if you have the means to actually change those variables and see if it works better, then why wouldn't you do that, right? And that's sort of like a thought that we both have, is like, why wouldn't you just try to make it work? Why wouldn't you just see what happens when you do it? And I think when you get down this rabbit hole enough, you start to realize you got to pick and choose. There's only so much time in the world. There's only so many hours in the day, so to speak. So, but when you're thinking of, like, in the context of trying to keep things, well, I don't know. Like, it's one of those things where in that video that I was referencing, I said a lot of words about how there's value in trying to see the better version of something. Imagine a version of whatever you're experiencing that actually actualizes the potential and delivers on what it could do. Or at least gets closer to that, if you want to consider that the promised land or the perfection or whatever. You want something that gets closer to that than what you already have. And I do feel like in order to do that properly, in order to guarantee, or not really guarantee, but increase the likelihood that your expeditions out into the conceptual wilderness at the thought frontier actually drive home and find success. And so to reduce the overall number of things you have to throw out, or maybe increase the pace at which you vet an idea and decide it doesn't pass muster, you kind of have to build up a strong conceptual understanding of everything that has contributed to what your current status is. Like, that's why I went back and played a bunch of classic FPS games, and why I went back and played a bunch of really old RTS titles. And it's like, I get a better and more complete picture of what constitutes the average person's conception of an RTS, and also what has been tried already to some degree. I haven't played all the weird ones yet, but it's one of those things where I've at least experienced enough of, like, the zeitgeist around these genres or these products and these types of products, that when I see something that is not working, I have a better idea of why it's not working, especially if it's in my own project where I'm intimately familiar with all of the working parts. And I think that's something that a lot of maybe aspiring developers will probably miss. And it's also a common refrain against this kind of thinking is that, it's the Chesterton's fence angle. You don't know why something is the way it is. And if you just decide to remove it willy-nilly or make changes to a set process, you're just as likely, if not more likely, to have it all crumble and collapse into flames and be a total disaster. As opposed to just suddenly inventing utopia. Like, odds are you're just going to have a total mess. And you need to proceed not necessarily with caution when you're working with software, because the worst you're going to do maybe on a programming level is BSOD your computer or something. So maybe you still do proceed with a little bit of caution, but conceptually you have a lot more room to explore. But it's consider the fact that maybe there is a reason behind this stuff. And then the more of a general premise you get of what the space is, you and I have both played a lot of RTS games down the years. And as a result, we can actually look at that and say, okay, well, if I'm working on an RTS prototype or something and I'm trying something completely different, for one, I know it's completely different. And for another, I know in which ways it differs from everything else that I've played because I just have those memories. And then I can reflect on that experience. And then if it's not working, then maybe I have a head start as to troubleshooting why it's not working. And that's probably something that a lot of people miss. And also, I think a counter argument to the idea that, well, actually, you should stick with the status quo because it's what we know. And if you want to call it the more conservative angle of it or whatever, where we're being very minor on that. As an indie developer, as a modder, or as whatever, you don't need to be conservative about how you approach these crazy ideas. You can just, if you have an idea and you have enough experience with the subject matter to know how that idea actually differs and diverges from the original content or the original product that you've experienced, then you kind of know what to expect, or at least you might have a couple of ideas as to what might not work out about the concept. You might have already in your head formulated a hypothesis as to this is the thing I'm expecting to not work out or could not work out potentially. And so that's the first port of call if I feel like it's not satisfactory initially. And then you can kind of go down that checklist if there's more. So yeah, does this ring true for your process in general when you were starting to pull from different genres or different RTS games for your mechanics, or had your own systems in mind entirely for something like Apex? Does this kind of square with that? Because to me, it feels like you would just naturally have this inclination towards you wouldn't want to avoid experimentation. Obviously, you would want to test ideas, but if the idea didn't immediately click, was this sort of a process for you? Because of your experience with RTS games, you kind of knew where to troubleshoot?
The process is a little different. I have all that experience, and of course, from Brood War watching, and I consider that more like a reservoir of reference material. There's a lot of cases where there can be, let's say, I'm trying to think of examples because I know there was ones, especially with Unreal 4, but I don't really remember. But say there might be an accepted knowledge that something doesn't perform that well, and that to build something a certain way is inefficient. Usually I will, even with that knowledge in mind, if I cross that bridge, I'll just do it anyways, because I prefer to see things for myself. I always will vet and build and then test anything on my own if I come to that point where I consider it, other than really rely on any external information. I will completely isolate myself from the way anybody else thinks or the way anybody else does things, unless it's strictly from an educational standpoint. I might reference that, I might try it, I might preserve something and then reference it later. But I rely only on my own faith and my own intuition and my own experience. I rely pretty much exclusively on what I know. Because I find that from any source of anything that I look at when it comes to conceptions of how stuff has to be done or should be done or how it could be done, a lot of the times, even from the most reliable sources, I find ways to either break it, to improve it, or I find it just doesn't work for me anyways, or whatever. When it comes to the RTS, there was, of course, the way certain balance is done. Like, I mean, even the all air projects as a concept is really goofy when you really think about it. But I still made like a half a dozen conversions that reached major stages of completion based on that concept alone. And when it came to like Apex, the way the AI was being done is this uncharted territory. Everybody thinks it's impossible. We walked that path. And when we walk that path, we find that Blizzard established a lot of conventions in StarCraft 2. Like, if an AI sees a specific unit, it tries to build counters for that unit. And that system was really just unnecessary bloat on top of everything else. And then we find along another way, there's another system that's telling the AI to build a whole bunch of shit that's also independent from the build order, and that was also really unnecessary. So we stripped that out. And then we go into the way the wave system was done, and this one I don't remember quite specifically because it was some years ago. But the way the AI logic was done was built. We rebuilt it a certain way, and then I tested it out, like specifically with the way defense and numbers were handled, and that wasn't really that acceptable, and that got changed. And then with the way the wave numbers were being handled, that wasn't really that great. So, it's like an iterative process. But that iterative process, I really only trust my own eyes and my own personal experience to really validate if something is really going to work, if it's going to work well and stuff like that. When I have an existing pool of knowledge, regardless of its source, if it's something that got lifted off the internet or something that came from a trusted resource, I just treat it exclusively as a resource. At the end of the day, knowledge is all homogenous. It's all sort of without any specific priority to any of it. It's just all a pool of knowledge to pull from. In that sense, when I make a project, when I make a video, when I do anything at all, I don't even care what anybody else thinks or what anybody else says or what anybody else has done or anything like that. Like, this doesn't even cross my mind when I'm building a project, is I think exclusively from my own perspective and what I want to accomplish with it. For me, a project is an extremely selfish thing, and most of my projects have never seen or will never see any activity from any other third person at all. A lot of the time when I built projects, I didn't even mention them to other people, not even the people I talk to every single day. I didn't even mention to anybody else except for HKS who bought me Stray that I was LPing Stray. I just started uploading the videos and said, hey, this is going to be up. These small things is like, I feel like that even considering the construct of a box or a status quo, or considering what other people are doing, or what the accepted approaches or the accepted concepts or beliefs or establishments of certain things within development that other people are involved with. I think that with the second that enters your mind, you've defeated yourself on one step already, where when you're building a project, it's going to be a selfish venture. Because even if you have a group of people building something, it's still, hopefully, something that you as presumably the lead developer are spending the most amount of time with. I think that if you are running a project, if this is your game, your mod, your whatever, and you're not the one spending the most amount of energy on it, you're already in a bad state. But at the same time, if you are in that state and you're not exclusively building it for yourself, and then maybe taking in the input of the other people who are building with it, you're also defeating yourself. Because this is going to be something selfish. It's something that all your time is going into. So it's something that you should really be emphasized on, that this is something that you want to do. If it's something you want to do, then you will never consider the opinions of anybody who's outside related to that. Of course, when we get into the realm of commercial products that are here exclusively for the purpose of making money, it's no longer your product, it's the marketing department's product. And then you're just building whatever the marketing department is telling you, trying to keep your HR department from suing you in some kind of custody battle. And also trying not to drop gamer words at the same time. And apparently not having a Cosby couch as well. So there's a whole bunch of these pitfalls you're trying to avoid all along the way that none of them really have anything to do with building a game. And to me, that's exactly the same thing as worrying about a status quo, worrying about a box, worrying about what other people are doing, what their conventions are, why they do them. Maybe you're already aware of these conventions. Maybe you're already aware that things are done a certain way. For me, that's the case with a lot of the RTS. Like, for me, one of the things with RTS is that I never follow is symmetrical base design and symmetrical map design. I actually don't really like symmetrical maps at all. It's an accepted standard because of balancing stuff. Well, I have never built a symmetrical map in the entirety of my time with RTSs and any RTS of any imaginable Warcraft 3, StarCraft, Homeworld, whatever, no map I've ever built has ever been symmetrical, because I just never found that interesting. I just try to balance it out even though it's non-symmetrical. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I figure out on my own, and I trust in my own instincts to determine whether something's valuable or not, because I've reached a stage where I can trust my instincts to really be in the highest percentile of being correct. And if it isn't correct, then I see that as an opportunity to improve my approach rather than it as being as something that I have to break my trend with. And let's say, for example, in the case of like a single player campaign with an RTS, I think I would end up with something that is very niche, because first of all, the difficulty is going to be absolutely insane. And I don't think even most of the people on your server would be able to get through half of a campaign building something like Brood War. And I'd be perfectly okay with that as long as I myself can get through with it with a lot of practice. And then at the same time, I might establish a lot of conventions people would consider not good. But as long as those conventions are something that I have tested and it's gone through my videoing process, then that counterexample is already provided, and it should be something that stands on its own. In the case of single player content, you're absolutely entering a realm where there is no real established conventions with a whole bunch of things. What you're viewing as established conventions are ideas that people have built, again, because they've been gaslit. People think that a single-player RTS campaign is something like Brood War or StarCraft 2. The AI has to just have pre-placed units all across the map and spawn stuff every few minutes or every 10, 20, 30 minutes in the case of Blizzard. And that there has to be some gimmick or some time limit or some other bullshit that takes away the focus from the fact you're supposed to be playing a fucking RTS. These gaslighting things, they've all been built, they've all been created as gaslighting because they've all been denying themselves the entire process of building the RTS. When I think about the RTS campaign, I don't even consider, even for a moment, any of the official conventions or any of the user-made conventions I've seen within the span of my entire life. For me, I wipe all that information out of my mind. I treat it completely as a blank slate. I completely shut down. I go into black box. I go into the FBI room, and I just say, the glowies no longer can glow. There will be nothing in this room. Complete and total darkness. And I will isolate it. I will isolate my thoughts from everything. That's the way I did my total conversions. When I started doing total conversions, there was a fair number of projects and a number of people still active in Brood War at the time. I didn't give a shit about what they did. I didn't give a shit about what they were doing, what they were learning, whatever processes or information they were bringing in public. If it wasn't a tool I was using, I didn't give the slightest fuck about it. Didn't matter. And maybe you miss out, like with D&D, the person who introduced me to D&D was somebody who basically like followed every fucking piece of information he could get. Every book, every Reddit, every blog. He just tried to absorb information like a sponge. But that created so many problems with the way that he developed stuff. He couldn't think of things on his own. He couldn't adapt to things on his own. He wasn't really a creative person. He really struggled a lot with dealing with interactions and stuff on the fly, with improvising on his own, and with building stuff that really stood out from the crowd as well. He was a product of his own homogeneous construction, where he blended into that crowd completely. I, on the other hand, again, I only reference official material. Everything else of it was completely from scratch. And I've certainly had to reinvent the wheel in a lot of ways as a result of that. But I feel like when it comes to things and being afraid of reinventing the wheel, is at least now you know why the wheel was round. You went through the process, and when you understand the process, as opposed to being spoon-fed the process, that information ends up being more valuable when you've got to invent other kinds of wheels later on the lines that maybe there isn't that pre-established convention or information for. And for me, the net value of a project is ultimately what I learned from it.
The thing that speaks to me about so you were talking about how like even worrying about the status quo kind of poisons the well a little bit from your project's conception. And that is, I think, implicit, but maybe not fully articulated in the warning that I put out at the beginning, which is that, if you get trapped in the status quo, like eventually you're gonna get to a point where you can't, and like I guess the example with that D&D guy, right? Like you can't even imagine a world that is disconnected, or any even aspect of your project that is actually disconnected from the status quo, everything that other people are doing. And I guess status quo is also an unhelpfully vague word when it comes to these really specific cases like custom content or whatever, where it becomes very granular in that, like, or fractal even, where there's like, this faction of people think that using started is A-okay. So like whatever the fuck they're doing is completely different than the people who are modding or these people over here that are doing something else or whatever. And so like that's an example where it's maybe not as helpful as when you're talking broadly when it comes to like a whole genre almost, or maybe even just something like a single player RTS campaign where there's more concrete ideas that people have shared about like more shared conceptions of what that constitutes, where maybe it's useful to avoid that, like you were saying. But I also see the value in what you're talking about, where if you're trying to isolate yourself away from that, then you don't have an intrinsic response. Because I do find that the average person that's in any respect like us and shares any of our values in this respect goes through a phase, at least at some point in time, where they just want to avoid doing something purely because it's been done before, or it's been done before in a popular product or something. And so if you really do pay attention to that, or you consider whether, thing X or mechanic Y has been done in a previous title, and that actually negatively influences your opinion of it, instead of just assessing whether it was good for that project or what could be a good deployment of it, then that's where you're going to get into trouble as well on the flip side. Just like you could get into trouble for adopting something just because it's been successful. If you avoid something just because it's been in a previous title, then that can't be the only reason. You know what I mean? So that can't be the only reason to avoid it. And you probably do dispense with that risk entirely if you just consider from first principles, what are you actually working on, and what does your project need in order to find success in execution. So like what ideas conceptually will fuel that best, and where is your first port of call? What is your first task to do to get that wagon train rolling in that respect? So I can see the value in it for sure. I do feel like it's very hard to do. It's very hard to go into the blackout room in that respect, as you were describing it. It's very hard to do that when you're also actively playing games, or when you've recently done something like that. Or when you're playing your own thing, like we're doing these fraud nights, and all that, which is usually mornings, of course, because LOL time zones. But you get these segments of time where you're focusing on just by playing like a prototype of what you intend to make later. That's going to influence things. That's going to build attachments and bonds and all this other stuff to mechanics and ideas that maybe don't actually fit the bill and should be reevaluated at some point. So I think it can be pretty difficult, but I can definitely see where it would come in handy from reassessing what you're doing from a first principles standpoint, and really thinking about like, okay, how does this actually work though? And what are the real ramifications of it? Instead of just what I've imagined in my mind or the associations I've built up over time playing it. So a word of warning perhaps in that respect, but we are coming up on time here. I don't know if you had any final thoughts on anything we've covered, to sum up your thoughts on the box, the status quo, any other terminology that we've brought up, or any other examples. I will say for my piece, it would be really nice if the discussions on these sorts of things were improved. I know you had touched a bit on this in your previous answer, that you try not to think about what other people are doing or saying, because you feel like it poisons your ability to properly approach project development. I feel like we represent two different like phases of development of ourselves in a way, where you're at the position now, and maybe this was mostly where you were always at, so you can feel free to elaborate, but it feels like right now you're at the position where you don't give a shit about what anybody else is doing as it pertains to your work. And I'm at the position where it would be absolutely fantastic if I could get, like, but through the work that I and other people are doing, we could actually improve the level of discourse about these subjects and improve the overall level of education about RTS games. And it's a lofty goal, and it's not my primary goal. My primary goal is still just to make the best thing. But that is still something that I'm interested in, and that's why I'm pursuing stuff like this, these podcasts and like other commentaries. So in that respect, it's like maybe I'm just not as steeled and haven't seen as much shit as you have. So I'm not willing to just throw in the towel on that subject just yet. But you can feel free to elaborate on what your take is on that, I guess.
Well, for one, I'm fucking terrible at communication. So I'm definitely not the person that should be trying to educate or discuss or illuminating anything. It's hard for me even to do the reviews that I do, because a lot of the times what should be a fairly concise thing to get through ends up taking me half an hour, sometimes many hours in the case of more advanced concepts like anything to do with the players and Autumn Wind, for example, it's taking me hours. And I got to review this stuff over and over again, constantly racking my brain thinking, does this even make any fucking sense? So when we go into even more complicated stuff that's even harder to explain, like with the game stuff, it's like, well, I do these podcasts and I try to explain, but it's still not really that great. And most of the time it's like I'm just preaching to the choir anyways. And then I know absolutely from experience that when you try to step outside that bounds, it's always going to be met with the absolute heaviest resistance. I've always been outspoken about almost every single thing I've ever talked about on here. Maybe not as well spoken as today now that I have all this experience reviewing and educating behind me. But, you know, it always has been a futile thing, and it's always has been and amounted to a waste of time. In my eyes, it's absolutely futile to try to go out and convince people of anything simple, much less anything complex. And I feel like anybody who wants or searches for those counterpoints or searches for things to be challenged, they're going to come out and find them. And I think that's how we have most of your audience. That's certainly how I have most of my audience, is I have always avoided doing any kind of advertising, any kinds of reach out and stuff like that. And I've always actively discouraged it. And in that sense, also to briefly bring up, only tangentially related, there's absolutely a difference between marketing and advertising. I think that advertising is fine, and marketing is one of the things that's killed the games industry. And that's definitely a subject for another time. But I mean, just to summarize, as an advertisement is something that you can seek out and find. Marketing is something that is specifically designed as effectively psychological warfare. And all the products today are all products of marketing. Advertising is much more harder to find any good advertising today. And when it comes to the project development, it's like on my mind, coming out of the experiences with Cosmonarchy so far, it is on my mind that if I had the time, I would actually return to StarCraft and make another large-scale total conversion, but focus on a campaign. And take advantage of a lot of things that you've added and reverse engineered, not simply as a revitalization of the ideas that Apex had, because I feel like a lot of the things I wanted to do in Apex, you are on the cusp of accomplishing in Brood War, or at least enabling in Brood War, but also to serve as an actual quantifiable example of the things I've talked about since Apex's first iterations all the way back in 2010. Because it has never left my mind from then till now the validity of the things I did put to the test. I think it would be hard to put them together in Brood War for a variety of reasons. First of all, I haven't done rendering for an incredibly long time, and I had to basically learn an entirely new graphics pipeline. And two, on top of that, I'd have to make most of my assets, and I don't think I can do that today. And of course, the time commitment in general, the way my life is I don't know if I'll even be alive in a couple of years. I don't know if I'll even be alive at this time next year. Things are incredibly volatile, and I certainly don't have the actual free time to devote to such an undertaking at that point. But it's one of those things that's like, it's something I haven't vocalized other than a few points. And it's one of those things that, again, you know, the status quo, my localized meta would be to say any such energy on such a project should probably be invested into Unreal instead. And at the same time, I think, well, when I was active, I can multitask between these two kinds of things because it's very different workloads and very different projects. And in some cases, that was actually beneficial to the way that I did stuff too, because the main enemy of compartmentalizing yourself and going into the black room is that you can lose sight of what is actually in front of you as well. And having ways to shift your mind back and forth before it was doing a project and then doing recordings and then going back to doing a project and balancing those workloads as ways to sort of detox between them. I've mentioned this kind of thing before. This thing can be done with two different projects as well. When the way I think today, it's like, well, I probably can't mentally handle that. But, when you talk about project development, the thing that I always viewpoint is there's not much point in talking when you could be doing.
Right.
So,
that's exactly it. I mean, when I said I would love to get the conversation level of discourse higher and the level of education higher, a big part of that, and probably the main driver of that, is the actual work itself, right? It is the products or projects that come out of the process. And then for those who are interested, who get tickled in just the right way by playing experiencing it via a playthrough or via direct experience playing it, those people can then go and look up the Big Boys table, or they can look up something else that comes along the way, or something to that effect, right? And then the resources are there for all to purview, and that's sort of the same thing as your video content, I imagine too, is that, if you had more technical demonstrations available for people, and even for the people who remember playing your content years back and then come back and rediscover what you've done since, that they're more likely to actually be able to interface with the stuff that you've done since in terms of the video content, and then that's there for them as well. I would definitely say that the podcasts and the interview appearances and stuff like this are secondary in terms of the work that is done. And while I do take them seriously and I do prepare for them, and obviously I care about like the audio quality, and in the case where there's video, the video quality, where I can handle it. There's a definitive like second like back seat that those things take in terms of priority, second priority then compared to the work, for sure. And it's one of those things that, like I said earlier in this particular cast, it's like I'm really interested in just working on a seemingly simple single player RTS campaign that has a decent length to it, that has all of the traits that we would expect out of a respectable RTS experience, we'll say, with AI that actually is trying to win, and map design that's not just toxic and in your face with like resource placements like Blizzard and stuff, like the old Blizzard of StarCraft 1, without being so, what would you say, like not docile. There's a term for it, sterile, as StarCraft 2, where it's always the same. So we're not doing the stupid shit about like Warcraft 3, where apparently people just build their town centers away from gold mines because that may ever make sense to do in an actual like in-universe context. Like we'll never do that, but we're also not going to always have them wrap around perfectly and stuff like that. Like these little things that seem really subtle, but they're actually very important to the overall complexion of how the world operates. And how it's conceptualized. And so being able to have all that and present it and say, here's an actual bona fide functional counterexample of, and technical and conceptual demonstration of these ideas that you and I have been talking about for so long. And we just have to hope that the people who are receptive to those ideas, I mean, that's casting as wide a net as possible when you actually release something for play. And then of the people who get wrapped up in that by really thoroughly enjoying the experience and seeing how much better it actually is than everything else, those are the enthusiasts that are more likely to jump through and hop on the server for discussion, or actually contribute to the overall discussion on this topic here and far. So yeah, with any luck, just by virtue of having an actual thing to play, it'll be many steps in the right direction just based on that. So then you won't have to do any talking, like you said. Yeah. So I think that will do it for our episode. It was a bit of a shorter one today, but I appreciate you working around my schedule, which has become very autistic lately. So hopefully that'll clean up. So.
It's 10 a.m. It's well past my bedtime. The sun is out. I'm going to start morbing soon.
There you go. Well, more about, homie. And until next time, weed in the box.
Get goat in the more bus and sauce.